Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Simon Walker. I'm the Director of Training for Maxon, and we've also got the wonderful Nick Harauz on the line. Hi Nick.
Hey, how's it going, Simon?
It's going well, thank you. Excellent. We're going to get started in a very few seconds, so thank you for signing in on time. This is great. A couple of little housekeeping things you've probably seen on the chat panel already. The chat panel's conflated all this text into one paragraph, but essentially we're recording this and you'll get the link later. And if you wanted to watch a previous one, then I'll talk you through those particular links. But just whilst we're here, let me make sure that you can see my dashboard. So if you wouldn't mind just saying that if you can hear me and see my screen, then that would be fantastic. Oh, thanks, Andreas. Excellent. Good stuff. So let's kick things off. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, David. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mads.
Awesome.
Great. Good stuff. Hi, Logan. So the idea is on these demystified sessions is that we're doing exactly that. We're taking some concepts and we want to leave you with a bunch of different techniques to be able to add these to your projects. So as usual, we're going to be jumping around different topics and showing you a few small little nuggets with a general theme about how you then would be using OBJ files and 3D objects inside Trapcode and how you can then link those between Cinema and Trapcode. And by the way, if you wanted to just check back on this blog, the Red Giant blog, I'll add the link. Here we go. Here's the link again in the side of the chat window. This blog is where we're going to be sharing a bunch of resources. Last week, we talked about project files and we uploaded the project file links to last Monday's session here. So if you go to that webpage, you can see a bit later on today or maybe tomorrow some of the project file links that we'll be talking about today. And that's going to be the same for all the rest of the sessions. And if you want to watch the actual presentation last week, just click on that link and it'll take you through to the actual recording. It might say register, but actually you can just go straight there. Fantastic, great. So what we're going to do is just jump straight in to After Effects and just let's have a look at Particular. So the thing about Particular is, as you most probably know, the fact that it can use an OBJ model as an emitter. And in fact, you don't have to have Cinema at all, because if you choose an OBJ model, then you can choose from this list of OBJ resources that are shipped with Particular. And Form and Mir, all three of those Trapcode tools can actually emit these particles. And by the way, just for fullness, here they are inside Trapcode. So it's Particular and Form, and Mir 3 are the ones that can cope with OBJ files. And I like to click on the designer and go to the designer for looking at these things. And if we jump into the designer, we can go into OBJ model, choose OBJ, same library. You can click on the top right and you can go in top right button, choose OBJ, and then you can go into that section. And what I'll do actually, I'll just turn off my webcam for the moment, just so because it makes the screen a little larger. A question from McNeil, what's an OBJ? It's a 3D object. So that's a great question actually. And so rather than having a single emitter, let's just reset this. Rather than just having a single emitter, which we've got in the default settings of Particular, we can use an OBJ to actually emit the particles. So let me show that. So if we use an OBJ, here we go, and then I'm going to choose a sphere from that library. Here we go, choose sphere. Where are you, sphere? And by default, inside Particular, the particles are at a velocity of 100. And so if you draw this down to 0, then you begin to see the shape. By the way, little tip here, if you double click on the motion block, then you can use some of these little presets like the zero motion preset that's built in, and that's a really fast way of working because then you don't have to spend too much time messing around with the individual settings. But in here you can now see the fact that these particles are being demonstrated by, or the OBJ file, the 3D object is being demonstrated by these particles. And there's some nice little tricks you can do with this. We'll talk about how you can do this with OBJ sequences shortly, but here's just a really simple little thing. Let's say that we wanted to make a sun and a planet, just like a kind of small little instructive graphical representation of this. So what we could do is we could then let's fade the opacity in and out with one of the presets. Here we are. And in fact, let's give a few more particles per second to this, say 200 or 300. And then I'm going to double click on the color swatch to then choose, say, something like fire to give particles like a sun-like appearance. And then, because we're in particular, we could use some physics and then affect these position of these. Let's do this, a couple of hundred maybe in effect position, and then fade those in slightly. So we're kind of faking that we've got like sunspots. Great. Now, the thing about particular is that you can have multiple applications of this within one instance of the effect, and you do this by multiple systems. If we click on the crosshair down here, you can have two systems within each other, and then we have the default single emitter inside the sphere. But what we could do also, we can duplicate systems. So a nice little trick, if I just click down here on the drop down and delete system, if I go into duplicate system, then I can then move that emitter to the side. Let's offset its position slightly. Just going to rotate using the rotate tool. And when you hover over the camera, you can see the keyboard shortcuts for the particular camera modes, which are exactly the same as the After Effects one. Then let's just reduce the size down a little bit, and then do some interesting things like you can emit from the edges or vertex points, or in fact the whole volume of various shapes. So you can begin to stretch out particles inside this 3D object. So you begin to get things that you wouldn't normally easily be able to achieve inside particular. In this case, I'm going to emit from the vertex points. So this is on the emitter block area, and then change the color to say blue. Let's change the size down a little bit more, emitter size. And then also, you'll notice that every time inside the system, if you have let's just completely reset block values for this physics block, then you can inherit or block the physics values from the layer above. And so I'm just going to, in fact, let's disable this block. If we disable that block, then we get the physics values from the top block affecting the particles in the secondary system. But what I want to do is actually have the default settings so that I don't have this block of the physics from the top block or the top system affecting. Let's just apply a little more physics to that effect position so it's a little more different. Here we are. And also I'm going to add a little more time to the particle life. Here we go. Not to both of these. Hang on, I wanted that to the planet. Here we are. So the planet life, just for a few more seconds. But really what I'm trying to point out here is that within one instance of particular, we have particles that correctly obscure each other whilst we have one instance of the effect. And that is something that is pretty tricky inside the hierarchy of After Effects because the way that it does layer stacks. But in this case, we just got a single layer inside particular. And by the way, if you wanted to just look at the settings, if we go into the emitter, these are duplicated inside the panel here, and this is where we can go into the different sections and the emitter, OBJ emitter, and where we want to emit via vertex points and edges and faces and volume. Fantastic. Great. Nice comment from David saying combining Larksui's lesson and this and a 3D flame, would that need to be an OBJ? Well, it's an interesting point because actually particles in particular and form are actually flat objects, so that they can always face the camera or they can be animated at an angle towards the camera. And I've got a good example of that to show you in a second. And also, just because we have got lots of things to show you in a short time, I'm going to just jump in between these topics. And an absolute classic thing I wanted to show you is the fact that you can have an OBJ sequence. And here is an OBJ sequence that had been exported from Cinema, and if we just go into particular, just look at how that's set up. Emitter is OBJ model. If you want to do this in the panel, all you need to have is the OBJ file inside your layer stack with the visibility turned off. Here it is towards the bottom of the stack. Let's just show you the layer name, horse object sequence. And you can point under OBJ emitter at that layer. This is how you switch from particular models. So you can do all this in the panel or the designer as well. How do you export sequences from Cinema 4D? Thanks, Andreas. We're going to be doing that very, very shortly. We thought you might want to know that. So the idea is that there is a difference between particular and form in the way that they render particles. So here, for example, you can see the fact that particular has got a wind expression. Well, how do we know? How do we know what's happening on this particular effect? I mean, you could go up to animation and reveal all modified properties. That's a nice, pretty quick way of just checking out to see what has been modified on here. And you can scroll through the various sections. You can see there's a wind Z value of -500, which is taking these particles. If I then set this to 0, then you can see how particular is animating or taking the animation from the particles from the movement of that horse OBJ sequence. But if I just undo that, there's a nice, easy way to do this in the designer. Quick little side tip. If you go into the designer for any project that you may have inherited and you think, what on earth is somebody corrected? Then the designer is telling you, because in each of the blocks, it gives you a preview of what's happening. And if there's a grayscale block, like there's no gravity on this, on the gravity block section inside this setup, but the physics section has this blue icon on it, and then every time that you see one of the parameters which is bold white rather than gray, it means that is the one that has got the adjustment applied to it. So it's a really quick way to find out, oh, this is the wind Z value at 500. And another quick little tip, if you double click any of these values, that resets it back to the default value. And you can do this for a variety of these settings inside designer, and this also works in SuperComp and Magic Bullet Looks. More on that later, because we've got some resources to remind you of these techniques. This is what happens if you're using particular, but what if you want, like in this case, you want something which is more solid, like we have with this run cycle here. So you want more like a wireframe for your OBJ. And that's a difference between particular and form. Let's just look at here. The form have particles which don't have a birth rate. They are, according to the marketing section of the Red Giant manual, they're immortal. So they don't actually change until you do something to them. And that's the advantage of them. If we go into this base form here, then we can see under OBJ settings, we can describe the particles from their vertex points. We go vertex points of the horse, or the edges of the faces, or the volume. And this is a good way of making these wireframe type animations. And by the way, this is a nice little trick. The particle density allows you to animate or increase and decrease the number of edges you might have in your model, depending on how many polygons it's got, without having to jump to and fro between your host app, like for example Cinema, and then output a lower polygon example. So it's very quick to be able to do this inside form. And the example I had here was these two were layered over top of each other so that we can do this. We can have some particles flying off an animation, as well as something as particles describing the animation. So this is form and particular together. Great, so that's just really a quick intro because we got so much stuff to look at, but I just wanted to kind of remind you where those settings were inside Chapcode. Great, thanks for your question, Ona. Is there a way to create liquid that is not transparent, like liquid metal? I do have an example like that, and that's something we can show you shortly, because we've also got some fun that you can have inside the fluid section in Chapcode particular and form. Great. But because a couple of you asked for how you can then export OBJ sequences from Cinema into particular. And Logan, I see that's something you'd like to know. That's good. Excellent. So we'll do exactly that. And by the way, when you import anything into After Effects in terms of OBJs, let's say import files, then you can't natively import OBJ files with After Effects without Trapcode, because Trapcode adds a nice little secret plugin that allows you to, let's look at the options here. Here we go. Allows you to, or for After Effects to see the fact that this is here we go, an OBJ sequence. So format OBJ files for Red Giant Trapcode, and then if you check the box, OBJ files for RG Trapcode sequence, and this works the same way in Windows and in Mac, then that's how you can bring in an exported animated sequence from Cinema into Trapcode. And this is what it looks like when you've brought it in. Let's just click on the reveal inside the reveal layer source in project. Here it is, OBJ horse sequence. So it looks a bit like a sequence of stills, if you like. Otherwise, it brings in single OBJs. So that's something to look at. Great. Okay, so I think this is a good time for me to hand over to you, Nick, because I think you've got something teed up about OBJ sequences.
I do. I have
Excellent.
something.
It's almost like we planned this.
I know. It's like we talked about it beforehand and decided how to make this go about. I actually noticed two things there, Simon, when you were working that I wanted to point out. One was when you hopped inside the designer, there seemed like there was an immediate increase in optimization of working with particles or OBJ particles. Am I correct? So like things just seem to be moving fast.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and
that's a good point.
And the other thing you were doing was you were moving around the designer with a camera. I don't know if you had mentioned that you can use the C key in there to really quickly navigate through your scenes, just like with an After Effects camera. And that is just a temporary view of how your particles can look when you adjust the camera inside of After Effects.
You're absolutely right, Nick. Yes. I should have said both those things.
No, I just wanted to mention because I saw you doing it, and I was just like, okay, cool. You're like showing such cool stuff, but I was just saying what I was taking away from that too. So I'm actually here inside of Cinema 4D. Now, I want to mention that this is the full version of Cinema 4D. And what's included inside is the ability to export a Wavefront OBJ, which is a still OBJ. I just want to show you this option. It's from the File menu. You go over here, Export, and you'll see the Wavefront OBJ. Now, when it comes to image sequences, OBJ image sequences, Cinema 4D doesn't have a built-in export. However, there is a company called Robyte, and Robyte has, as you can see here from my webpage, a OBJ sequence exporter for Cinema 4D. Best part about this, Simon, is that it is free. So all you have to do is go to this website. I don't know if this is mentioned in the notes, but it will be. If I will make sure it's inside my keynotes, but you can just basically go to this website
now
and download this sequence exporter, and then that's going to allow you to export image sequences from Cinema 4D over into After Effects. Now, there's something that you want to keep in mind, and I have an example to show you. I'm going to close this down. I'm going to go back into Cinema 4D, and I'm going to head over here to my content browser. Now, when I look for content to bring over personally into either form or particular, to have it referenced as an OBJ or OBJ image sequence, I start to look for objects preferably that have a small amount of polygons. So the big question is, how can we find out, if an object is low poly or not? The reason for this is, if a 3D object has a lot of polygons, that's going to basically affect your performance inside of working inside of particular. On top of that, it's going to build in almost too many particles and make the object too dense. Not to say that you can't actually bring down those amounts, but it is much lighter on the system if you work with a low poly object. So this dog actually came from a sculpting section of the 3D objects, which is additional content that ships with Cinema 4D. And I wanted to just show you that you can find out the actual polygon counts or points that this object is made of by simply either selecting an object in a scene and going to Object Information. See here, Simon, it's saying the polygons are 1450, the points are 1438. That's pretty good, okay? Now, I added an animation here, you can see, to this actual dog. He's just rotating around. This was done really quickly with the default dog base. And to export this, since my plugin is installed, I would just go to the File Export menu and use the OBJ Sequence Exporter. I want to save the sequence export in a folder because it's going to basically export 90 images for the 90 frames of my actual project. Okay? Now I want to compare this to something else. I'm actually going to get rid of the dog base. I already have it in After Effects. But I'm going to go back to the content browser and I'm looking for humans. And under humans, there's this category up here called 3D humans to animate. And I'm going to double click and add this to the scene, this human. If I head over to objects now, and I'll just go to object project information. Simon, you see how many polygons are with this particular shape?
That's a few more.
20,000, yeah. So there is a way around this with certain objects. Inside of Cinema 4D, you can actually, I'll show this in a little bit, but wanted to mention that under the Create menu, I believe it's under Generators, is this object called a Polygon Reduction. And you could use this on an object, right? Basically have it as have this as a child of the object, and that's going to reduce the amount of polygons that are in a given scene. At the expense, though, that your objects might look slightly different and be less dense. Overall, personally, this is a good thing, I think, for particular and form, Simon, because a lot of the shapes that you'd be creating for OBJs as a base, you're going to want to have them. You're going to want to have them to be abstract. And because they're abstract, you don't need to necessarily have a lot of information associated with them. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when you bring in a large poly model, then you have to change the scale of it and the particles are too close to each other. And even when you reduce down the number of particles in that slider inside form, it still doesn't look right. So that workflow of reducing the polys beforehand, I think, is quite useful.
Yes, and so I'm actually now here in the designer with a blank copy of form. And what I'm going to do is change the type, as we've seen earlier, to an OBJ model. And I'll go to choose OBJ, which is the same area we were in earlier where we access presets. And this time, directly from here, I can go to add new OBJ. And I can hop over into my system and take a look at the man OBJ that I exported, the 90 frames there. And once I press OK, you'll see here the man has been added. And I'll just go here and apply that to the scene. So what's great when you go inside form, the particles from where they're being mapped to are the edges of this object. And you'll see here the amount of particles currently visible in my scene, Simon, happens to be 95,000. Let's switch that to volumes because I believe in living dangerously. And we should see, oh wait, no, that didn't work the way I intended. Let's just see here. I'm trying to increase the actual amount. Let's go with vertices, maybe that, nope. No, in fact, that was the highest one in that particular case. Just based on the way that the object was created, edges is at 95,739. What I'm going to do is I actually have the dog image sequence here inside my project, and I'm just going to reference that instead in After Effects under the OBJ settings of the base form settings. And you'll notice that this was, again, an image sequence in this particular case. And I just want to show you the large difference in physical particles. 31,000 versus 91,000. Believe it or not, in the designer or working inside of After Effects, this is going to have some differences in terms of performance on your system. And if the end of the game is to create these abstract shapes where particles are mapped, whether they be spheres or lines, I think having fewer polygons overall is just going to be much better for your workflow. I wanted to show you an example of Polygon Reduction really quickly too. I have a building here that was taken from Cinema 4D's content library again, and this was without any reduction in polygons. This particular form setting, if we hop over into the OBJ settings, you'll notice it's being sent from the edges of the shape. And if I go over to show form, that's 195,000 particles. Here, I actually performed something called Polygon Reduction on the shape. And it did get rid of a little bit of the quality of the overall mesh. But when working in form, again, and looking at the particles, I was able to get rid of almost half of that total, right? So this overall, like to get rid of half of the particles that are going to be mapped to your objects, while still, pardon for the pun, maintaining the form or the general form of the object is pretty cool. Would you not say, Simon?
That's very cool as well. And it's worth pointing out, Nick, if you go down to the rendering section inside Form, where you can choose between CPU and GPU, if you're using points like you have here, the default particle, then CPU is going to be the fastest method for rendering those points because they are 3D points in space, and the CPU is excellent at calculating those points in space. But if you then change those to be sprites, then GPU will help because those sprites need to be loaded into the graphics memory beforehand. And it's just showing that fact that you can switch in between these two settings inside the designer as well as in the panel too. So it's just a quick question. That's an answer to the question I often get asked of why not just leave it set to GPU all the time? Well, it depends if you've got the default particle sphere or whether you've got sprites. By the way, quick question from Jay, can you import Fbx sequences into Particular? And the answer is currently in the shipping versions, it's just OBJs and OBJ sequences. But Nick, if you could just show that base form where it says the drop-down OBJ model down there, wouldn't it be nice in there if you could then select a cineform object with an animation attached to it as well? Well, the joking aside, that's exactly what we're working on, and this was teased at the recent C4D live show. So for that particular option, I think is very interesting, not only for particular and form, but in answer to Onar's question, which is he feels like a lot of the animations he sees for form in particular are swirls or sci-fi looking transparent animations like heads-up display. Can we push form and particular in a different direction to make more organic solid forms with more depths and less mesh or transparency to them? Yes, we can. We would use Mir for that. And we've got a couple of examples as well. Nick, can I grab the screen for you? Because I also wanted to answer that question about fluids and water.
Hold on.
Since you've got your spreadsheet, or not your spreadsheet, your keynote up, probably a good idea to talk through a couple of those points.
Yeah, I'll quickly cover these points, and I just want to let everyone know that they have access to this after. So I'll send this off to you, Simon, and you guys will have access to this PDF. This is just a summary of OBJs. I always like to refresh myself of that OBJs are supported right now in particular form and trapcode Mir. Mir does not support OBJ image sequences at the moment, and this is a little bit of a typo, but you should know that OBJs in general, in terms of form and particular, is that OBJs are used as the base or where particles are being emitted from. They won't be the actual particles themselves. You got a ton of OBJ presets. I would also recommend that you look at Mir presets too, because some of the OBJ models there are awesome as well. So there's presets of OBJs in particular form and Mir. in several ways. You can map particles of an OBJ, as we saw, the volume, the edges, the faces. So we can map those particles as well as play with the actual density. If the, let's say the mesh itself is too dense, the polygons are too dense. Don't forget that using multiple systems like Simon showed you with the horse there to build complex maps or emissions of particles that are mapped to your OBJ, that's awesome. A few other things, just OBJs are great for fluid simulations. I feel like I'm setting that up somehow, Simon, but we'll see. Low poly OBJs serve well. TurboSquid and Sketchfab are also great resources for models, OBJ models that you can download. So you don't need Cinema 4D necessarily. You can go online and find an OBJ to work inside a particular. Now, right now, Cinema 4D exports still OBJs. You need that image sequence or plugin. And last but not least, we just talked about it soon. Trapcode will support Cinema 4D files through, is it Cineware?
Cineware,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, that's going to be very exciting because you can do all sorts of things with Cinema inside Trapcode. So we'll be sharing more information about that when we have it over the next number of weeks. But we just wanted to let you know for two reasons. One, since we're talking about these sorts of workflows, and secondly, since our CEO made this public that we're working on it, so we can talk about it. Great. Okay, let's jump over to show my screen. By the way, a couple of things that Nick was just pointing out, the idea about using Cinema 4D to create these OBJ sequences. Something that I found out that could be useful. The wonderful world of Voronoi fracture allows you to smash things up. As you probably well know, it's inside the Motex menu. But one little kind of rule of thumb, in case you are planning on exporting these, if we go to Voronoi fracture and we go down to the cache, you need to bake the cache before you run the OBJ export. Otherwise, you'll just get multiple instances of your very first OBJ file. And that's something to look out for. And something else that you could do inside Cinema really quickly that will be tricky inside After Effects is to use these effectors to do even simple things like this. I'm just running an effector across some text and the effector is set to rotate those text elements. Now, if you could export that as an OBJ sequence and then emit particles from that OBJ sequence, that makes it much faster to be able to then come up with ideas and have extra iterations for Mograph designs. So just a couple of things to look out for. Great. Now, what Nick alluded to was the ability to have fluid simulation applied to OBJs and particles inside both particular and form. Oh, quick question from Olivier. Should we talk about model sequence instead of images, PNGs, or EXRs? Okay, great. Yes, it's the sequence of the actual OBJ. I'm not sure what you mean by the different. Perhaps you could give some clarification. I might have answered that wrong, Olivier, but please feel free to type that in as well. And question from Randy: name of the plugin that allows OBJs to import it for particular. It's called Rowbyte, and I've added that to the chat notes in the webinar, and we'll add that to the link that you automatically get, the email follow-up that you get in about an hour with all the links to these things as well. Great, so let's jump into Designer and also let's just have a look at them for a moment under these presets. Right at the top, we have fluid single system presets where you can do all sorts of fancy things like create fluid manipulations of particles. And you do this inside the physics area, and then you can choose the physics model fluid. And we might do another special session just on fluids, actually, but for the sake of time, I wanted to give you a quick cheat, if you like. The most fun you can have with fluids in particular is under the multiple system presets. So if we click on the multiple system presets up here, and then we go into fluid, I'm just going to go down to this one called Torus Collision. That gives away what I wanted to show you, actually. And as Nick said, also, if you hover over the camera icon, you see the C shortcut, so you can cycle through rotation like we've got here, or you can then do translation and also zoom in the same way that you can do After Effects. But just very quickly, here we've got our two systems, and if we disable the visibility of the second system, we've got an orange torus used from our OBJ library, and it's the torus that ships with particular from our library. And also we have physics applied to it. We've got a vortex ring, which is actually firing at 90 degrees across the screen. So that it's taking this original ring and it's using the physics fluid simulation to actually move these particles around, which is lots of fun to be able to do this. But the interesting thing is that if you have another system set up where you've got the opposite going on, you've got the torus at the right hand side of the screen on system 2, and it's firing the particles 90 degrees to the left of from the right hand side of the frame to the left. Because you have multiple systems, these particles then can interact. So the forces cause these particles to move out the way or interact with each other. And it's the forces that are doing that and then making the particles move. So this is a great way of pretending that there's something else in your scene inside particular without having to build a whole 3D physics model in Cinema. So this is great for pre-visualization. The nice thing is that this never gets old, absolutely.
Oh yeah, it's
and you
amazing.
Can mess around with, I know, it's so much fun just to play with. I've just changed the buoyancy, and so that in this example, the preset is very neat because it's got equal and opposite physics. But if we change the buoyancy, then these things swirl around in 3D space. But I wanted to show you this, that you don't have to have them visible for them to interact. We can switch off the visibility of the second system, which is quite nice because you can then pretend that you've got something in your sequence. And I've got a rough comp here. So forgive me for my compositing skills, but I just wanted to show you how effective you can make something look within a few seconds. Because in this case, I've just got a keyed out character with a fake background. I've just got this set up with, she's keyed with Primet Kia. I'm using, in fact, look how lazy I am. I'm using the actual preset for the fluid movement. And it's appearing as if she's got control over these particles in the scene. And we've got a little color correction in there to kind of light her as well. So it's a nice little fake setup, but it just shows you that you can combine these particles into scenes with just a little work. And by the way, if you're interested in 3 weeks' time thinking, what was Simon talking about? Combining particles, what can I turn off? What can I turn on? We've created a whole bunch of little quick little tutorials, and they're on this YouTube channel with 20-second tutorials, and there's dozens and dozens of them. We'll add the link into the notes, but I just wanted to point this out. Where is she? I added this. Oh, here we go. Simulating interactions using fluid dynamics. And in this case, 20 seconds worth of just reminding you where this is set up, the fact that you can switch off the system, and the fact that you can then comp this over layers. So here's the green screen for that, and then just comped in with some glow. I'm using optical glow on there as well. And in many of these, we like to give the project file as a download available. So feel free to look at the description of those particular setups as well. That's all background though. I mean, as cool as this looks, that's not what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you this in form. And this is probably the most long-winded answer to the question about, can you make something look like fluid? So let's just jump over to form. Form has a similar set of fluid movement. And it's slightly different because, as we pointed out earlier, form particles are immortal. They don't die. They are always available. And let's just jump in here. So this is the standard form default layout. And form has particles always available. So when you're looking at something in form, even though you've got playback, when we move this around, the particles just stay in their position because you have to do something to them before they move, which makes them perfect for 3D objects. But in any case, we just jump back into the presets here, single form presets. And in fact, let's just show you this sphere drop. This is what happens inside form. Let's just rewind this and just show you. We've got a sphere. It could be a whole range of different things. Let's just use an OBJ model just for argument's sake, in the same way that we're using a particular. Let's just use an array bucky. Use that one. Here we are. If we then add fluid with a negative buoyancy on the screen, what happens is that it then just kind of falls through the screen because we have that negative force, which is like you have coins or sand suspended in water or fluid. This is the idea. The fun stuff happens though when you go into the multiple form presets. And is it too nerdy to have a favorite preset? Probably, but this is my one. So here we go. Here is the setup. I'm using the cylinder drop preset. And if we then just have a look at what's going on here, we've got 3 items in our systems. The top one is, let's just rewind it, a sphere, which has got a fluid drop on it. And if we just play that back, it begins to look a bit like an ink drop falling through water. Great. If we then turn on the second system, that is a sphere or a cylinder. And what's interesting about this is that on the cylinder, if we click on the fluids, you can set, fluid, you can set the fluid to have no fluid force. So it stays static through the scene. But because it's mixed in with the same set of sequences inside form, it then talks to the other sequences. Sorry, not sequences, systems. They're not layers. I mustn't call them layers. Layers mean stacks. Systems mean 3D. I sometimes forget and call them layers, but they are systems. Anyway, so if you do this and press playback, then your fluid motion can actually then distort that model, which is really interesting. And you don't have to have the visibility of the original blue ink kind of drop. You can then just have this model being distorted by those fluids, which is loads of fun, especially when we jump back into the ability to show particles from, say, vertex points or edges or faces. Let's use faces and let's ramp up the particle density. And so we can make something look a little more cohesive, a little flatter, without necessarily having to spend a lot of time doing it. And you can have up to 8 systems, so you can fire these different fluids at these elements from different angles as well. And just a quick little amendment to that. This is the fluid example I wanted to show you. Let's just search for it here. Splash. I think I've got it here. Here we go. Oh, here we are. Great. So this I stole brazenly from Hash's tutorial, which is, where is it? Here. Hash's cheap tricks tutorial, where he goes through the effects that he wants to make for like a fake Aquaman title sequence. And so he's using the fluid dynamics of form to be able to create movement of particles. But then there's a lovely little trick to make them seem like they are actually more organic or more looking like fluid. And I'll add that link into the notes whilst I remember. Here we go. And here's the trick. We are using the rate at which those particles are distributed, that fluid rate, here we are. And I've got a little keyframe on this where I'm just keyframing the size of the particles to 0 so they appear to disappear. But this is using that form fluid. There we go. So that's the background. That's what's moving the particles. But what's really interesting is that if we turn on a different layer and apply our old friends CC plastic and CC glass, which by themselves look terrible. So if we turn on, let's just fast forward here a little way. So this is the particles that are driving this movement. And inside, if you haven't used these are plugins inside After Effects, or effects inside After Effects, which have been around, goodness, how long have these been around, Nick? 15 years, 20 years?
Oh, pretty much. I can remember at least from CS4 and CS5. So a while, if not sooner, but they've been there since the beginning.
Absolutely, and the thing about them is that if you're used to using them, this is just plastic, and all I'm doing is I'm pointing at that animation layer with the taking on the alpha. I think Rand is right, at least 20 years, absolutely.
Yeah.
But using them together with messing around with the height and the direction of the light, we can kind of fake some sort of a watery type of look that perhaps we could use as a transitional element. So while the fluid systems inside Particular are actually using fluid dynamics to move the particles, because of the nature of particular form, the best you can get really is kind of faking this plasticky look without having to do this in proper 3D. And that's the whole reason, that's the whole point at which you would then jump into something like cinema if you wanted to do this with a little more finesse. And X Particles is fantastic for doing these water simulations. But the general plan really is if you can do something quickly and you can go through multiple iterations, maybe you're brainstorming different design ideas, this is a great way to do this. And Logan's jumping in with he says using glass with expressions, linear time remapping and displacement to make some nice trippy art. So in fact, that's a great idea, as you suggest, Logan, to have a random webinar and long lost effects that are still good. Absolutely. Great. I'm going to hand over to you, Nick, because we've got a bunch more things to do and the time is moving on. So let me jump over to you. Okay, here we go.
Hold on one sec. Okay, and show my screen. Cool. So I've been experimenting a little bit recently with, everyone sees my screen? All good, Simon?
Yep, it's all good.
Okay, awesome. So what I want to do is actually just solo this and kind of talk about it a bit. But I noticed that inside the content browser of Cinema 4D, there's a bunch of architecture models, and all of those architecture models themselves, just to let you know, are fairly low poly in their density. So I'll just show those to where they were. Let me just see if I still have my city scene here. Okay, cool. Just to kind of break this down, I went into the content browser and looked for, I think it was architectural elements. Maybe not, buildings. Buildings is better. And then under buildings, there's a collection of cityscape buildings available for you. This is that additional content you download after you've installed the full version of Cinema 4D on your system. With S22, it's just gotten over, I think, 12 gigabytes worth of content. So I took these buildings, and if we took a look here at the objects, you can see here that they're all within a kind of a group or a null object being referenced by a cloner, and I actually ran some Polygon Reduction on some of these. The random spreading of these is based on what's called a plane effector and a random field to sort of spread them out here in space. And then I have a camera kind of looking here down on the scene. I think one of the magical things about OBJs, Simon, I wanted to mention that when you go here, my intention is to animate these in After Effects, but I could do some animation that if I go to the Wavefront Obj and just export this, it's going to take that camera data, right? And then when you bring that into, while it doesn't see it's necessarily, what I meant to mention is it's going to see all of the buildings inside this scene, and then I can have it referenced by trapcode form or particular. In this case is, structures like buildings where you want mapped particles that you've mentioned, Simon, static particles, it's always best to go into form, but it's going to see all of these particles right here. So let me hop into After Effects and just show you a few things here, but this is my form city layer. And what I've done, if I deselect the cat key, is I have two base forms at play here. One form in particular, you'll see, is of course referencing this OBJ. But if I look at the OBJ settings, in this case, it's just referencing the faces. And I do want to mention that I brought down the particle density quite a bit to sort of get a little bit of a lower opacity look. I thought usually I'll go into compositions and blend different forms of mapping. So if we take a look here under the OBJ settings of this one, it's being mapped to the edges with a low particle density as well. And then these two forms are just combined together. I then added, and I do want to make mention of one thing in form which is super useful and maybe useful for this scene. As I twirl up the several properties that exist, there is a section here called Kaleidoscope. And what I think is kind of cool about this section is automatically it will actually make kind of a mirror-like reflection of your form particles. Not to mention that you can play around with transform settings to switch this, or even map this to the horizontal and vertical perspective. Not to mention play with where the center is located of that kaleidoscope. So this could add for some really cool abstract effects. In this instance, I was just curious to play around with form and the new Vfx Reflection that's in the VFX suite. But what I loved about this in particular was the ability to sort of create a little bit of blur and noise in the reflection, not to mention just have a kind of a cool fall off as you see here, Simon. I then added just a preset of form, which is like, there's a bunch of grid presets that have lines that are sort of being animated across the screen. So I added one form of grid there, and then I had a grid overlay on top of the overall scene here. Fingers crossed that this is going there, so you can see that. There you go. So you have two lines of kind of a animated flow of that were automatically animated because they were presets. And then I combine that with, if we see here, an adjustment layer. And on that adjustment layer, I'm just using two of my favorite effects from Universe. One of them is Hollow Matrix, which is just great with these form particles to kind of give some digital distortion. Nothing really spectacular here. I used an actual preset. And when you talk about this, I just opened the dashboard to look at in After Effects in particular. If we go over here to Hollow Matrix, you have all these like presets based on, you know, popular feature films. I'll let you guess which ones from the categories and the names, like Only Hope. And then you can easily take one of these presets and kind of apply it to your scene, and then dial down the blending of that scene by blending with the original. I then combine this in particular with a Universe Texturize effect. One of my favorite films recently, Simon, I don't know if you guys have seen this too, Blade Runner. Which year is it set in? Is it 2049?
2049.
2049. A lot of the screens that you'll see in that movie, the heads-up displays, have a lot of textures on top of that to give it an old weathered look and technology. And I find that Universe Texturize, that the grunge-based textures here, do a great job of, you know, adding to OBJs or your overall kind of form sequences. And while this still needs some work, I kind of combine just the proxy file with some moving elements. This is just a lower resolution file and some digital distortion to kind of get a cool end look. I mean, in retrospect, I would also animate the reflection here to really sell this effect, but kind of cool what you can do by just bringing in things from Cinema 4D and then using a form as your engine and then several systems. So I thought that that'd be kind of a cool thing to show. Simon, I wanted to show one more. I wanted to show one more. Thanks, man. I wanted to show one more thing too. Just another setup that I'm sort of playing with, and I'm just in love with, is the easy ability to work with kind of cloners and cubes inside of Cinema 4D. So I just want to show sort of a basic breakdown. So as we know that OBJ objects are either the base form or they can be used as something to emit from. And what I'm going to do here, in fact, I'm actually going to just start this from scratch. It doesn't take too much time to set up. I'm going to add a cube to my scene. By the way, this is massive and not good for a cloner. So I recommend just coming in here and really bringing down the size. If you do so, and I'll press Option, if If I select the cube and press Option O, that's a really nice handy shortcut to frame up your cube. I'm actually going to make this cube editable because all I'm interested in, Simon, is one of the surfaces. So here we have, drawing from my After Effects experience and terminology, a postcard in space. The difference is I want several postcards in space. So first of all, I'm going to come up here and actually hold down the Option key to add a cloner to the scene. And you'll see here that my cube is now spread out over the cloner. And by default, the object itself is a grid array, which is a great setup for this. I might increase the Y count to 3 just to have 3 of those rows, and then decrease the actual size. So something like 50, 50, 50. Okay, so again, just a bunch of postcards in space, but I want some sort of randomness towards them. And in order to do that with this cloner, I'm going to come up here and add a really simple effector. And to do that, I'll just go to the Mograph menu. Here under the effector, you'll see is a random effector. And by simply having the clone selected, the cloner that I created, the effector, the random effector, is now affecting the clones. And I can go into the parameters here and sort of fool around with the position that's being randomized. And I'm also interested in rotation. So I'll just rotate these cards kind of around here in 3D space, and you get the idea. So let me just take this scene setup and really quickly give this an OBJ. I'm not going to add this with animation, but I have another one inside of After Effects that has animation. Okay, so Obj Export. And just to differentiate this, I'll put this on my desktop and call it cubes still. Okay, so inside of After Effects, I'm now here. I'll double click inside this project, and there's my cube still OBJ. These are just postcards in space. I know that they're flat, but you can picture them with cubes as well. The whole idea here, though, is that if I add like a version of particular, what I found really cool was to use, there we go. We see the default version of particular being added here and emitting from a point. But just for this example, let me actually go into show the emitter, and I will choose to emit this from an OBJ model. This time I'm actually just doing it in my After Effects sequence, but usually I would do this inside the designer. But since it's already in my After Effects project, now I have that cube. And while this doesn't look like much by default, let me first of all increase the quality of my composition. A bunch of spheres are being born specifically from each of those cards in space, which I, by myself, randomized. And I find that one thing you can do to really get a hold of this is that there's this direction value here. What I'm going to do is set this to bidirectional. And you'll see now that you have controlled movement both towards and away from that actual system, which is pretty cool. If I brought down things as well, kind of like the general velocity, you'll see this better in terms of how it's forming around that object. But what I thought, in retrospect of this, is that kind of ability to then, I just lost my train of thought here for a second, to combine this ability here of these particles being emitted and controlled by that bidirectional control, along with aux particles to create kind of particle trails, Simon. I thought that was a kind of a really cool setup that you can utilize. I do have a form example of them moving these cards kind of around in 3D, not to mention a secondary aux particle system, just a secondary system in general that's being affected by turbulence. And while this is not a fully finished example, I just wanted to show more about the possibilities of if you have like multiple cloner objects, you can use them all as emitters, and that can be super powerful for a few things. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, I think so. I think that's the takeaway from this, because sometimes you can spend a long time in After Effects trying to set something up which is much quicker to do in Cinema, and if you can combine those and just use those as the driving forces for movement, that's going to speed up the number of iterations for your designs significantly.
Yeah.
I've just took a quick look at the isn't it fun when you're doesn't time pass when you're having fun? Exactly. Because
Yeah,
I've got a couple of things I just wanted to finish up with Mia, but this looks like an interesting thing. So if you bear with us, we'll probably run over by about 4 or 5 minutes. We try and keep these things to an hour, but I don't think we have yet. But I'd love to see quickly your setup there, Nick.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show, when it comes to Cinema 4D or After Effects and particular, I know that we were talking about OBJs primarily, but do not forget about the power of After Effects lights. And also the power of being able to import lights from Cinema 4D. You can bring in that light data. So I just wanted to show, I have an example here and a few things here. This is a really simple setup. Took me less than a second, but there are these, I'll just show you quickly. There are these splines available in Cinema 4D, such as a helix. And this helix shape, the cool part about it is that you can use a spline to animate a light around a path, okay? So you'll see there that I kind of created some changes there with my helix. And by on the light, adding this animation tag over here at the side, it's called an align to spline tag. I then just told it to, hey, reference the helix, and then basically animated the start and end values. Now there's a gotcha specifically with OBJ files, and also something I think to keep in mind with when people are going to be importing Cinema 4D files in the future. And that is that sometimes with these files, the OBJs in particular, you want to bake animations. So this keyframe information, this is not a keyframe, it's kind of like an expression, and you want to bake it so that After Effects sees it. One way to do that is with animation. If I go to my animate layout, you'll see here that I have this kind of align to spline selected. I'm just going to head to the function menu, and you want to use the bake objects option from here, not the one from the objects panel. So it's really important to do so in the animate menu. And once you do, that's what kind of took this light and turned it into a series of keyframes, as you look at here, this light copy. Anyhow, wanted to mention that, Simon, and that's what I used for this animation right here. So just to kind of look at particular really quickly, it's referencing that Cinema 4D light based on its name. And I have an emitter here that's, again, so you can see the light, 2,500 particles are being born per second. And most importantly, just notice how low my velocity is, along with that the emitter size is set to 0, so that these particles are really fairly tightly lit against the actual light path, which is cool. Now, combine this, I actually added a little bit of physics in here, some turbulence field to affect the size and position of these particles. Specifically, a little bit later in time, if we look at the fade-in times, the turbulence field starts at around 4 seconds. I actually did one more thing here too with these lights, and that is I actually combined it. There's an adjustment layer on top with, as you guys know, my favorite universe texture. But in this instance, I'm not using the opacity. You can see the opacity set to 0. What I've done, and what's really cool about this texture, is that it has a displacement map that's set right now to 0.3 horizontally and 0.6. So these particles are being forced to run through a grimy bricks texture, kind of creating this distortion here at the edges. And that's what I wanted to show. That's what I wanted to show.
Fantastic.
Let me find you. I know you have something to show too, Simon. So I'm going to find on. I have this long list of people attending, and I just want to make sure I select you, and no one accidentally.
Yes, we volunteer somebody to share the screen. Yes,
volunteer someone to present.
We should do that.
Randomly, who wants to present next time?
Yes, exactly. Cool. So thanks for bearing with us. I just wanted to mention, just to finish up, I only spend less than 2 minutes on this, is an answer to the question that we had earlier on, which is, can we make these things look a little more formed with surfaces and textures rather than just the UI type elements? And the answer is, yes, you can do that. And typically the best place to do that in the Trapcode suite is inside Trapcode Mir. And Mir has the ability, Mir 3 has the ability to choose an OBJ model instead of just a standard plane. And I think it's worth, we'll also note to do a whole section on Mir because there's so much to talk about it. But in a nutshell, Mir can import OBJ models. And we've got a very similar setup in this case. I created very lazily this text inside the MoText menu in Cinema and just exported the OBJ file. Here it is, OBJ pointing to that OBJ master down here, which is actually called Trapcode text. And the advantage of being able to do these things inside Mir is that they have surfaces rather than emitting particles. That's the essential difference. But what it does mean is that we can do some nice things like changing the material on the surfaces. And these are responsive to After Effects lights as well, these surfaces. And this is the thing I wanted to point out, the fact that you have the ability to have reflection maps as well. There's a lovely preset gold here, which shows you one of the reflection maps, which is built in. And these are the 9 or 10 reflection maps, plus you can have your own custom one. You can import an HDRI file and have that as a reflection map. But it means that you can then create interesting reflections or fake reflections, fake radiosity, if you like, because we're still in the classic 3D renderer inside After Effects. If we just reduce the sharpness down this a little bit, then you can quickly get some text in there, which you can move around and do the normal thing is to kind of make it look more expensive than the time taken to do it, which is the definition of design, somewhat, maybe. But the two things really is that these environment maps here allow you not only to control the reflections, but allow you to set up a fake scene. And here, for example, we've got a model with a texture applied to it. You can apply textures inside Mir. And this model is reflecting the environment map. And it's because the environment map is the same as the one in the background. And if you experimented with Trapcode Horizon, and here's Trapcode Horizon inside Trapcode Suite, Horizon allows you to project the inside of a HDRI image onto the inside of a virtual sphere, which is what's happening in this case. If I've got Horizon and it's pointing towards that HDRI image in the layer, and that means that I can then move the camera out from the middle point of the layer, and I always see something in the background. So it's a nice trick if you want to have something in the background whilst you're orbiting slowly around some text or something. But what you can do very nicely is you can then put a Mir plane in the middle of this scene and kind of fake a 3D scene, because this Mir object is pointing to that same HDRI map. And that's a nice little trick for making things look a little more cohesive, or selling something which is a 3D scene without having to spend the time to set that up specifically. The reason for this, why would you do this rather than not in Cinema? Well, apart from the fact that you can go in right at the last minute, let's say go into Horizon and we change the orientation of, say, the background. Let's just make it like so. So we're quickly, say maybe in front of the client, doing something without having to render, just to change the nature of the story. So the plane is now banking rather than we're orbiting the plane. But also because you can set up animations with particular. And in this case, I've got another object. This is the Cygnus spacecraft with a circle of, or a ring, I should say, of particular elements to it, because this is taking on board the ability for Particular to control the visibility via these depth layers. So obscuration layers, of course, in particular have been around for a while, but we can set up a Z buffer layer which then can talk to the mirror layer and then force those particular particles to run behind it without having to set this up as a proper, I would say, scene inside Cinema. So a number of different workflows that you can choose depending on the amount of time you've got to throw at it. And by the way, we've got another example under the 20-second tutorials just as a reminder for exactly that setup. If I explained that too quickly, which I did, apologies for that, but here it is. I'll put a link into the notes as well. Here's exactly that technique that I just showed, but in 20 seconds. So an even faster way of me saying it too quickly. There we go. And also in the project notes here, we've got the project file and a link to the model and the HDRI image that I used. I get a lot of stuff from TurboSquid and Sketchfab, so shout out for them. They've been my savior over many years where I haven't had time to model something. Fantastic. So thank you everyone for bearing with us and having what I probably should be now describing as speed training from now on. Because what we thought, we'd calmly just run you through a whole series of things, and suddenly we've just been throwing stuff at you. But I mean, that's the whole point of these things, just to give you an idea of small little elements that have saved us time and been allowed us to deliver projects in the past. But thank you, Nick, also for being on board with these things. And
thanks, Simon, for having me.
It's great.
Yes, I always learn some stuff off you every single time, even just like sitting in a webinar. It's amazing just how deep you can go with particular and form and OBJs.
There's so many things inside there,
yeah.
and I think it's just nice to have this forum to be able to say, oh, and this saved me, and so on. So yes, I totally agree. And likewise, I always make notes when you run sessions too. So
yes.
So next week we have, here we go. Let's just look at next week. This is the main webinar area, so please go here. I'll put it in the notes for updates. For example, over the next couple of days, we'll add in the project download files and also that keynote presentation that Nick shared into this page. But also, I just wanted to show you that next week we'll be looking at animating particles with audio. And also not just particles, all sorts of things that you can do in After Effects. And we'll be jumping into form, especially with that. And also some of the other tools inside Trapcode Suite where you can then start to animate things without using keyframes and make your life much easier, or at least do graphics more quickly, put it that way. Fantastic, great. So thank you for the nice comments, everyone. Thanks you, Mark, Onar, Steve, Logan, Jury, appreciate it. Please feel free to sign up for next week or share this link to anyone who you think might find it useful. And also, please send us in recommendations for future ones of these. We've got some nice, interesting setups over the next couple of months, but we're planning to do them every Monday for many months. So if you've got any requests, let us know. Yes. We can jump into those topics too.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Nick.
Yes.
You can send them to me, training@maxon.net, or even training@redgiant.com. They both come to me. But fantastic. All right, thanks for spending this time with us. And there's some requests coming in for topics already, so thank you. All right, we'll see you on the next one, and we will try, but not promise, to keep it to 1 hour. We'll see. All right, take care and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.